Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Institute of Politics. Welcome to our IOP Speaker Series event titled 2024, It's Getting Real, a deep election dive with a bevy of campaign experts. I'm excited to welcome today's speakers as they preview the race for the White House and control of Congress. My name is Luca Navarro, and I'm from San Diego, California. I'm a first year here at the college studying political science and economics. Here at the IOP, I'm a columnist at The Gate, the undergraduate political journal, and this past January, I participated in the Iowa caucus trek. Today, we are joined by an array of members of the IOP Board of Advisors. Amy Walter is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. She also hosts WNYC's The Takeaway and contributes weekly to PBS NewsHour's Politics Monday. Howard Wolfson is a seasoned Democratic political strategist. He served as deputy mayor of New York City of Governmental Affairs under Michael Bloomberg and communications director for Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency in 2008. Tim Alberta is a staff writer for The Atlantic and author of the best-selling book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and rise of President Trump. He also served as Politico's chief political correspondent. Claire McCaskill is a former senator from Missouri who now shares her political insights as an analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Senator McCaskill also co-hosts the podcasts How to Win 2024 with Jennifer Palmieri. Stephanie Murphy is a U.S. representative of Florida's 7th Congressional District. This past fall, I was very fortunate to attend her Pritzker Fellow seminar series titled Going Deep on the Intersection of Business and Politics. And moderating today's panel is David Axelrod, the founding director of the IOP and former senior advisor to President Obama. Before our panel begins, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please be sure to silence your cell phones. Also, at the end of the event, we'll have time for questions. So if you have a question, please make sure to line up behind the microphone at the rows. And as always, priority will be given to students. And with that, let's now extend a warm welcome to Amy Walter, Howard Wolfson, Tim Alberta, Claire McCaskill, Stephanie Murphy, and David Axelrod.
Hello. I am mindful of the fact that there is a group here that may suffer sunstroke during the course of this. So, but it's good to see you all. I want to point out that Howard Wolfson is on the injured list and did not make it out for our board meeting, but Astead Herndon from the New York Times is here, host of the podcast, The Run-Up. So we have a tremendous supply of really smart and insightful people. So let me just start, and we'll go down the row here. Amy, we'll start with you. Where are we in this election campaign? We're 5.5 months out. Where is this race?
Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. Great to see you guys. You can never complain when it's this warm in May in Chicago, is what I say. So I'm okay with it.
She says sitting under the tent.
I know, that's fair, but I am, okay. So where we sit right now is we have all the makings of which, by the data, looks like an first-term incumbent who is in a very, very precarious position. And if this held up for the next 5 or 6 months, would lose re-election. This is a president who has very low job approval ratings, whose overall record on the economy voters think is pretty poor. But the most important thing to me, and the difference between now and 2020, it's not that people suddenly have decided they like Donald Trump more. People haven't really changed their opinions about him. What has changed is the lens with which they look at his presidency. So they're not looking at him personally, they're looking at his presidency, and they're comparing the Biden presidency and the Trump presidency, and they're saying, well, okay, with one of them we didn't have inflation, with one of them we didn't have the chaos in the world, with with one of them, we didn't have the situation on the border. I think we should go back to that. The challenge then for Team Biden, and I think we'll probably talk about this, part of the reason why, again, a team's in trouble when they are asking for a debate. When you're an incumbent and you say, let's actually have multiple debates and let's start in June, I think they told us exactly how precarious of a position that they think they're in as well. But part of the reason that they focused on doing that was the need to make this race about more than just remembering what the past presidency of Donald Trump was like in terms of his policies, and put it more on who Donald Trump is and what he would do as president as 2.0. And that is really, I think, the whole challenge here for Biden, is making the campaign less about him and making it more about Trump.
Which is a traditional challenge for incumbents, to make sure that it's not a referendum but a choice. In this case, it's imperative. Astead, one of the features in the aforementioned data that has been very, very consistent is that Biden is doing much less well than he did 4 years ago with young people, with African-American voters, with Hispanic voters. Is that, there's been enough data that you want to say that's a real thing?
Absolutely. I think that Amy describes the kind of macro state of the race really well. I think if we look at the available data polling-wise, the Times Battleground that just came out, the driving force for Biden's struggles, if you believe where the numbers are right now, is with young people, is with kind of non-white voters. And we've seen that kind of Democratic enthusiasm really drop off to the point where if you would ask what's Biden's best path to re-election, you would actually look at the least diverse battleground states. You would talk about the Pennsylvanias, Wisconsin's, Michigan's over the Arizona, Georgia's, Nevada's, and that's a different place than we expected Biden campaign to be. What I would say is, like, as someone who interacts with them, their theory of the case hasn't really changed. They feel as if when the public tunes into this race, and they don't feel the public is largely tuned into this race, that they can make it a choice election much easier. And we just did an episode of The Run-Up that focused on young voters, and even Democratic-aligned organizations like Next Gen America currently say that Biden's only winning 18 to 34-year-olds by 9%. Like, if that number stays the same, he'll lose the election. But all numbers also say that when they put information in front of young people about Donald Trump's presidency and about the kind of down ballot issues, that they see them come back to them. So that's the macro theory of where the Democrats still aren't and think in full panic mode, is because they believe when the evidence is put in front of these folks, they are able to win them back. But, just besides the choice between Biden and Trump, one feature of the things that we've done has been how much of this race is defined by people who don't like either option and people who feel upset with the political system altogether. And so I think that is going to be the kind of overarching headwind that they face, is the kind of emergency lever option that they ask people to pull in 2020. For some people, and especially young people, that's having less and less of a potency. And whether it is because of Biden's age, feelings about the economy, or even what we see happening in Israel and Gaza, the argument of lesser of two evils, if you could distill it, is hitting less and less with the communities that they've pitched it to, non-white voters, young people. That might change come November, but I do think it's a harder proposition the second time around than the first, and that's what they're facing.
And this implicates third-party, potentially the influence of third parties. They weren't really present as much in 2020. They were in 2016, arguably turned several states over to Trump. And so that's something to monitor, particularly Robert Kennedy. Claire, Amy mentioned the debates. This thing happened very fast. Obviously, Biden made a decision that he had to debate and chose to do it next month as the first debate. You, as a prominent Democrat, do you see this as an opportunity, or are you filled with angst?
Both. Both. I mean, it's a high wire act because it will it will be a defining moment, and it will be in June. And if Biden does well, channel State of the Union.
Yes.
If he is pugnacious and aggressive and frankly behaves in a way that traditionally would make Joe Biden uncomfortable, I think it'll be great because it will be a contrast that will resonate with folks. I think one of the things that it's interesting, we spent all morning talking about IOP at the board meeting, and one of the things that hasn't come up that I think will still be a defining thing in this election, and that is the Dobbs decision. I believe that young people and voters of color feel very, very strongly that a fundamental freedom has been taken from more than half the population, and frankly, from everyone, because it's not just women that this impacts, it impacts men too. And the Republicans, Trump realizes the mistake politically, and he's trying to, back that truck up. You can hear the beep, beep, beep all the way from his golf cart, but it is very, very difficult for Trump not to own the fact that Republicans are forcing women who are having miscarriages to bleed out in emergency room bathrooms. He is forcing women to travel in my state, and I used to prosecute these cases, young girls who have been raped by their stepfather or their uncle. In my state, they are forced to give birth by the government. And so they have to travel. And they're not letting up. The Louisiana legislature right now is about to make the medical abortion drugs a controlled substance. So it would be like it's methamphetamine or crack cocaine if you get caught with one of these pills without a valid prescription. So that wing of their party is not going anywhere, and they're going to keep pushing for nationwide bans. And I think it is the silver lining to the cloud that I mentioned previously this morning. I think the fact that two parties have nominated these two men have probably done some serious damage to the two-party system.
Claire, just one follow-up on that. I asked you about what the opportunity was. I asked you about angst, and you said both. Let me explore the angst for a second. What if Biden doesn't perform well? It seems like there's a risk of, I think he was right to go early. It seems like there's a risk of doing this before the convention, because if he doesn't do well, there could be a full-out panic. And what are the risks of him not performing well? And it's not just about whether he goes on the attack, it's about whether he appears collected in command of the moment and so on.
Yeah, I certainly there's a risk. But frankly, he would have to do really badly for it to change the level of panic that's out there now. I don't meet anyone.
Sure, Democrats in the audience will find that reassuring.
I am still at the point when I walk through the grocery store, people come up to me and grab my hand and say, "We're going to be okay, aren't we? He won't win, will he? They won't let him back in the Oval Office, will they?" So I do think there is a level of panic out there, because some people who look at all the facts and circumstances go, "Wait a minute, how could this be tied?" Right? How could this be tied after everything that has occurred? So I think the panic is there now. I think if he does well, that panic will lessen, and hopefully it will bring some of the folks that have been expressing their opinions in these primaries about really difficult, nuanced, painful topics will come home. And that is not unusual. As you know, David, I walked down this road with you in 2012. It wasn't like there weren't a lot of people voted against Barack Obama in the Democratic primaries. There were.
Right.
Frankly, more than has voted against Joe Biden. Yep, look at it. I did. I looked it up.
Okay.
So I think he would really have to do badly to make it him totally unelectable. If he does moderately badly, I think it's just a matter then of them pushing the messages, healthcare, and the things he's gotten done.
So you reported what happens to you in the grocery store, but people are having another experience in grocery stores. Biden has a great I think, a fair argument that he's shepherded the country through the pandemic, and in a way that we landed more favorably than almost any other peer country in the world. But that's not the prism through which people are looking at the economy. You're a guy you live in the middle of the country, you live in Michigan, you've studied the Republican Party for a very long time, you used to work for the National Review at one point. Answer the question that Claire asked, how could this be tied, given everything that's happened?
Sure. Well, and I guess just to be really blunt about this, the question is not just how could this be tied. The question is not just, to Amy's point, how could Trump be ahead. I think the question is, if some of these trend lines hold, we need to accommodate ourselves to the reality that Trump could not just win, but could win very comfortably, right? That's something that nobody seems comfortable saying out loud, but it's the truth. David, you mentioned earlier, if I can detour ever so slightly before I answer your question.
As long as you come back.
Yeah, I will, of course. But, in 2016, when Jill Stein was on the ballot, Donald Trump...
Green Party candidate.
Yeah. Donald Trump wins the presidency by a combined 77,744 votes spread across 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, right? That's the margin for error. 4 years later, with no third-party spoilers and with historic, unprecedented turnout jumping, respectfully to Senator McCaskill, Obama did not see a raw vote decrease between 08 and 12. Biden is almost certain to see a raw vote decrease between 20 and 24. You're not going to see the turnout this November that you saw in November of 2020. So Biden is able to win. He's able to squeak by with a similarly small share of the Electoral College in 2020 when all the stars were aligned for him, when the election was a referendum on Donald Trump, when the incumbent president was deeply unfavorable, had very low job approval ratings. He's talking about injecting bleach into his veins during a global pandemic. Everything's breaking for Biden exactly right, and he barely wins, right? So how could this be tied? Well, for starters, we live in a hyperpolarized country where both of these candidates are starting with a base of support that's, I would think, David, you could be the expert in speaking to this, but higher than arguably at any time in our lifetimes. As far as, I had a very smart strategist say to me a couple of years ago, we are way past the mass persuasion era of American politics. This is all-out trench warfare. And I think that that's right. So understanding that if you're Donald Trump, I was in Wildwood, New Jersey this last weekend at his rally. Whatever numbers you believe, if it's 25,000, if it's 100,000, I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. But it's a lot of people, right? It's a lot of people. I spent the entire day there just walking around talking to people. This is an enthusiasm and intensity of support on the Trump side that is not going anywhere. The Trump base is going to turn out to vote. The Biden base, as of now, we are seeing a lot of indications that it is not. The erosion among young people, the erosion among non-white voters. I was just having lunch last week with an elected official in Detroit who, keep in mind, Michigan was a comfortable margin of victory for Joe Biden back in 2020. He wins the state by 150,000 votes, right? That's comfortable in this trench warfare age that we're living in. This elected official from Detroit was saying that they believe we could see as much as a 20% turnout decrease in Detroit this November, right? So why don't people want to, why doesn't the Democratic base want to credit Joe Biden with some of these legislative wins? Why are independents and especially some of the suburban college-educated women who swung from Trump 16 to Biden 20, why do they hold him responsible for the bad economy? Those are interesting questions. All of the
yeah, it's the one I asked.
Yeah, it's the one you. And the funny thing is the focus grouping on this. I've sat in a lot of focus groups in the last 6 months. I would even go back to your point about Dobbs. We've seen focus groups where up to half of the people in focus groups believe that Roe v. Wade came down during Biden's presidency, right? So I think we have to.
That he was responsible.
That he was
it happened
during.
Right.
That's exactly right. Right. That's exactly right. And so, the why of it is fascinating, and it's probably above my pay grade. See me passing the buck on this to Stephanie, but
I was waiting for that.
we're dealing
payoff here.
But we're dealing with sort of an epistemological crisis that runs parallel to our political crisis, and. Democrats, what they will tell you is that all the money they sink into the polling and the focus grouping, but also into the sort of voter education, it's not returning right now. They're not seeing any return on that investment.
So, Stephanie, elections, we always talk about issues, and obviously Dobbs is a big issue. Abortion rights is a big issue. But elections are, in the end, they're always about narratives. Who controls the narrative? What is this election about? The Republican message is pretty clear, which is the world's out of control and Biden's not in command. I think that summarizes what the Republican message is. What is the Democratic message?
So this kind of goes back to a focus group that I watched once, and they asked the people participating in the focus group, if you were to draw just one image that represented the Republican Party, what would it be? And most of the time it was a dollar sign. And then they asked the question of Democrats, what would you, about Democrats, what would you draw to represent Democrats? And it was like either nothing or like all kinds of different things. And so I think this is part of the maybe structural challenge for the president is that, Democrats are a little wonky about a bunch of different things, but particularly this White House and this administration has been bad at storytelling. And when you run an election, there are three key pieces: message, money, and machine. And on message, he's talking about bills and things that we passed in the last Congress, much of which the money hasn't gone out the door of the agencies and the departments and aren't making a difference in people's lives. So when he talks about chips, nobody has a new job at a semiconductor factory yet. When he talks about infrastructure, nobody's driving on that new bridge, new road, or has broadband reaching their rural area yet. And so I think voters are hearing about government spending, which voters don't really respond well to that, and especially when inflation is rampant in the economy. But they're also not feeling the impacts of what the Biden administration wants to tout. So that's a big challenge. But maybe I can end on an upside note: is that on message, he has some work to do, right? He has some work, and he also needs to talk a bit about the future, because elections are about the future. What am I going to do to make your life better? And right now he's in a little bit of a deficit because people, when polled, believe that his policies made their life worse, and they don't believe that a second term would make their lives better. So he's got to dig himself out of that. The upside is that he has money. He has significantly more money than Donald Trump. And money is used to build machine, which is the voting machine, the get people out, get people registered into the polls. And so if his campaign is doing a good job using those resources, that is one advantage they have over Trump. Although it feels to me sometimes that Trump's voters don't need a machine to get them out to vote. They are self-motivated, so self-motivated that they're willing to, show up at these rallies, ransack the Capitol, do whatever he tells them to do. So they don't have to have the same kind of grassroots campaigning that Democrats do.
Yes, and you're right about the three M's. And if this is a close race, the organizational advantages that may accrue to Biden as a result of that, and the fact that Republican organizations in Michigan, in certainly Arizona, but even in the three upper tier states, you have Democratic governors. The Republican parties are in some state of disarray. That is potentially advantageous, certainly in Michigan. But Amy, message is important, and I guess part of it is, Bill Clinton said two things. Very, very astute politician. He said, elections are always about the future, and he said, strong and wrong beats weak and right. Seems to me that the second is a challenge for Biden, and the first is an opportunity if he can create a contrast with what the future would look like.
That's right. Which I think this debate will end up being. And to that point, just to throw another, I'm curious what everybody's take on this would be. If there were, say, a not great performance by Biden, it is still 6 weeks before the convention. Would something be hatched?
Well, that was the question I was trying to ask before, but I wasn't
Yeah.
as direct as
Okay. Does that really happen? I
Yeah,
find it-
David, would something be hatched?
You know, everybody has
I'm
this.
a commentator.
Yeah, everybody has this impression that the Democratic Party has this like smoke-filled
Yeah,
Exactly, that there's a secret
Yes.
person
Yeah,
waiting.
and what I always say is I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat. I
Yes,
mean, like
I-
I could not imagine us getting our stuff together in time to do anything meaningful at the convention.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the truth is, it would require Joe Biden to say,
Yes.
and that's not going to happen. And we don't live in, this isn't the 40s.
I know.
You know, we don't live where the party bosses march down with their fedoras to the White House and give the bad news to the president. That's not the way it works. So I'm not a
I
big
believe
believer in
too.
that.
But man, okay. So we talked about message, and we talked about, it has to be about the future, and it has to be about the voters. And that is the conversation that many people made a sort of a similar point about, what does it matter if you do show up? Why does it matter if Trump is president versus me being the president? And it's less about Trump and his behavior and what happened in the past, and much more about what would it mean for you and your family to have 4 more years of me versus 4 more years of him. And the president has a very difficult challenge when it comes to the economy, because when you're president, there's not much you can do about there's nothing you can do about inflation in terms of fixing it. Now, the Fed can do stuff, but you can't fix it.
That's an unsatisfying answer.
It's an unsatisfying answer. So this is why when you hear the administration over and over again talking up how great the economy is by traditional metrics, it's not sinking in, because people say, that's great. Yeah, unemployment's low, stock market's great, we're building bridges, but ground beef is still $2 more expensive than it was a year ago. I do not understand how that's possible, and that people do not appreciate that even if inflation, we keep talking about inflation going down, it doesn't mean that prices go
Cumulative.
down.
It's
right?
cumulative,
It's cumulative. So to me, the best sort of way that I can explain this disconnect is a poll that asked this question. I thought was a smart way to do that. Okay, your choice is you can get more money in your paycheck or prices go down. Which one would you pick? And over half of people picked prices going down.
Yeah.
And if you're the president, you're like, but we can talk about more money.
But your
in
first
paycheck.
your first point, I think, is really important. I think the president can pursue credit, or he can pursue votes. But I think if he pursues credit, he does so at great risk. And we learned that when Barack Obama was running for re-election. We felt pretty good about how we had shepherded the country through what was potentially the second Great Depression. But people weren't ready to pin a ribbon on us for that, because they were still experiencing the effects of that recession. And so we had a much more populist message about who was going to fight for the middle class, and about predatory interests and the question is, can Biden?
See, this is the challenge, because who's winning the pot? It was, no offense, but it was a little bit easier to pin that on a Mitt Romney.
Of course, 100%,
who's,
100%.
Private equity.
I'm not saying.
Yeah, no.
that- I'm
But
not-
this is where the challenge comes in, about if you're going to do a mano a mano populist argument. I don't think that Biden can win that. I guess the question has to go. And
Well, I think he can. I actually
How
think
did-
he can move some. I think he can.
But on what
I mean,
issues
Trump is a
specifically?
social populist, but on economic issues,
Yeah.
I mean, his major legislative accomplishment was a $1.7 trillion tax cut that primarily benefited the wealthy. So he wants to deregulate everything. He offered the oil industry the right to write their own rules in exchange for $1 billion in campaign contributions. I think the president's got a few things to work with there. Astead, so one of the, when Tim ran down the election and why people would think it shouldn't be tied, the one thing he didn't say is, well, the president got tied up in that insurrection. He had all these indictments. And that was thought to, well, that's an incredible burden to carry into an election. It powered him to the nomination, arguably. And I would argue that it's helping him now because it adds to this sense of indomitability, right? He's resisting all of this. How do you see that playing in all of this? Does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, I would take this from a couple angles. I do think it matters. I might be a little I don't think Biden, to your point, I think Biden does have a story to tell, partially because if there's anyone who's close to being just as unpopular as him, it's Donald Trump, right? And I think that the reality of the indictments has both let him tell a persecution narrative that has helped him in the Republican primary, but it's still a reason why he loses swing voters at a high clip. It's still a reason why when people are, again, as I said before, are reminded of the chaos of a Trump presidency, you do see them come back towards Democrats. I think that Donald Trump also, as someone who hears him on the road a lot, is a radicalized, I would say, figure from 4 years ago. And so when we see the version of Donald Trump that people will be presented come the fall, I don't think it's out of the question that the Biden premise that the voting public is kind of shocked by that I think that could totally happen because he is much more fixated on how to weaponize military, how to undo the judiciary, and he's going to say that out loud. And so
this debate will be
100%. I think on the Biden point, that's the good news for a Biden campaign. I much more believe that he has less of a message problem than a messenger issue. I think we massively overrate look back to that primary. Age was an issue 4 or 6 years ago. They very vocally implied one term. When we talk to people on the road, half of them, Democrats are shocked that he's back in the first place. And so I think that there is a little bit of an overinflating of the electoral position he was ever in from the start, even if he got to a better place in the general election. So I'm saying when we're talking about young people, when we're talking about non-white voters, particularly younger, non-college educated Black and Latino voters, they were never with Joe Biden. Yeah. And so some of what we are seeing is a return back to a problem he has had from the start of his presidential candidacy that I think that actually we underrate a little bit. And so that's something that I don't know how much he can fix, to be honest with you. But a time machine. Yeah, I'm like, the biggest Biden criticisms I hear when we talk to the marginal voters who I think are going to most decide this election are fundamental. They are not about policy. It is about future question. He is an inherent bad answer to that question because of if you look at him. Yeah. And I think that is a real problem.
But you do have. But I mean, it is what it is, and he has to try and overcome that. Let me just.
Can I just say one more thing? Yeah. I think the answer to that is not in the top of the ticket. It is in the abortion referendum in Arizona. It is in the down ballot possibilities in Wisconsin. I think the idea of reverse coattails of Democrats telling you a broader story of the reason why you vote can totally help Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. So while the issues as a messenger, I do believe are fundamental, I think the top to bottom party health story, the reason why they've done well in the midterms, the fears about democracy implosion are all stories they can say that can come from a party level that might help him even outside of his individual problems.
Claire, on the trials, there's a trial going on in New York. I don't know if...
I hadn't noticed.
And it seems to be hurtling to a close. Play it out. Does it matter if he's convicted? And if he isn't convicted, by he, I mean the President Trump, does that have a tangible impact on this election?
He won't be acquitted.
He
That-
will
if
be.
anybody wants
if he
to
gets
bet
a hung
you-
jury, he
if-
will
if-
play
if-
it as an acquittal.
If anybody wants to bet you, take the money that he will never be acquitted. Probably, I'm guessing it might be a hung jury.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a wash.
Claire,
Because I think the
asked you
majority,
this question, I should point out, as a former prosecutor.
Right.
so.
unlike a lot of people you see on TV that talk about the criminal trial, I actually have done a bunch of criminal trials.
Would you
so-
have done this one?
I don't know that I would have done it when it occurred or at state court. This case belonged in the Southern District of New York. And I can put some blame right at the feet of Merrick Garland on how he handled everything that occurred after January 6th. The delay, the failure to look at the facts on the page and take out of the equation what it was going to do to DOJ, what it was going to do to the presidency. He should have just looked at the facts on the page and made a charging decision and moved forward. If he wanted to put a special counsel in, fine. He didn't have to wait 2.5 years. So all of this happening now is one of the reasons it gives Trump's narrative so much lift, that this is a political persecution. If this had occurred 2 years ago, you might not even see Donald Trump as the nominee, and then we'd really be in trouble. But
I do love, though, this dual messaging that Biden is so incompetent he can't tie his own shoes, he can't put two sentences together, to which I always say, but he's not going to serve two sentences, so that's, but somehow he's masterminded this scheme
Right.
with prosecutors across the country to bedevil Donald Trump. It's you got to choose a horse and ride it, as far as I can see.
yeah. Well, and also, as you well know, David, we need to quit looking so much at those people that are going to show up and vote for Joe Biden no matter what, and those people that are going to show up and vote for Donald Trump no matter what. They are not going to decide this election. The people who are going to decide this election are people who maybe voted for Trump in 16, but not in 20. Maybe some that voted for them in 20, but Dobbs and J6 is just too far for them. I'm speaking to you, Republican women in the suburbs. That is a huge sweet spot that Joe Biden can mine, I believe, because, and here's the deal. You know what? I will tell you what I think Joe Biden's message is. Joe Biden's message needs to be, he's just a jerk.
Yeah.
Do you want to watch him for another 4 years every day? I mean, politics, presidential politics, as David painfully knows, sometimes comes down to personality. I mean, the guy he used to work for, I mean, part of the problem was that Barack Obama was so smart and had a way of using $10 words when a quarter word would do. And, you know, he had to really work at really being a connecting person to everyone. Joe Biden is a pretty decent guy. All things considered, he doesn't change wives like Trump changes shirts. You know, I mean, he doesn't lie from sun up to sundown. I do think the contrast here will come home to roost. And I do think it's a mistake to cut off Trump's microphone in the debate. I think he thinks it's a smart thing to do. That the longer Trump talks, the more trouble he gets in. And I think shutting off his microphone, I don't know if, has CNN
Well,
agreed to do that?
I don't know, but I will tell you this. They may shut off his microphone. They're not going to shut him up from talking.
He'll keep talking.
Because part of his goal is going to be to rattle
Biden.
I will say, I have a very well. I mean, I've embraced this theory many years ago. I've talked to some of you guys about it at the time, about people choosing the remedy to what they have. That's how presidential elections generally work. It's most true when someone's leaving office, but I think in 2020, I think that is exactly why Biden won, because he seemed like a decent human being and people were done with Trump. But he's the incumbent now, and the question is, what are people trying? What are they trying to correct? And you know, I would say what they're trying to correct potentially is weakness, and that's what Trump is selling, which is
Right.
strength. But Tim, you wrote a wonderful book. Really, I recommend it to everybody, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, about the evolution of the evangelical movement. And your father was an evangelical pastor, you're evangelical. but you talked about the capture of the evangelical church by starting with Jerry Falwell to now. You've got a guy in Trump who's violated 11 of the 10 commandments here, and yet is the candidate of evangelicals. And just take a minute to explain that, because it's easy. I mean, I make jokes about it, but it's easy to. I think it's hard for some people to understand.
Yeah. I'm going to need more than a minute, but I'll do it as concisely as I
No.
can.
Take
Two. I'll take two, yeah. So I think this was alluded to just a few minutes ago as far as Trump's criminal challenges in the court, and how far from driving his base away from him, it has actually endeared his base to him. I mean, to put this in the broadest political context, after the 2022 midterms, we saw for the first time in 4 or 5 years significant real daylight, a real opportunity with self-identified conservative Republicans and self-identified evangelical Republicans falling away from Trump for the first time because he was a loser, right? They blamed him for the 2022 midterms, right? And we saw, I mean, it was in the data, it was on the ground, you saw it in the focus grouping, and Republican consultants and pollsters were all looking around saying, wow, this could be it. This could be the beginning of the end for Trump. And there was a real chance that a DeSantis or a Haley or someone was going to be able to seize on that. And then what happens? Alvin Bragg delivers that first indictment, and if you go back and look at all the polling, public and private, Trump's numbers, which had been doing this, suddenly did that, right? Why? Well, this ties into the question David's asking, because I think so much of modern evangelicalism, and I'm specifically talking about in the white Reformed evangelical tradition, in the suburbs and in the rural counties around this country, so much of it is wrapped up in a persecution complex. So much of it is wrapped up in the idea that this country, which was once theirs, and they will say that, in the abstract, that means, well, it was informed by a Judeo-Christian ethic, but it was also theirs, wink and a nod, right? That country no longer exists, and their way of life is under attack. Right? Their way of life is under attack by the secular, liberal, progressive, woke, Marxist, deep state pagans who want to indoctrinate their children and eradicate
Just looking
God.
at you, people.
Yeah, exactly. Eradicate the Almighty from public life. That Christianity is still the one bulwark that protects them and protects their families, protects their communities from a liberal secular takeover of this country. So therefore, this is no longer a political battle. This is a spiritual battle, right? And when you see the barbarians at the gates, as these people do, you take a look around and you start to think, well, maybe we need a barbarian to protect us. And that is Donald Trump in a nutshell. That is it is somebody said to me at one point, well, you're talking about him almost in terms of a mercenary relationship. And I said, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. And we should recognize that the inevitable follow-up to this is, well, why do these people feel persecuted? I mean, why do they feel like the country's out to get them? Why is there this sort of cultural paranoia? I think part of the mission here with the IOP is to build bridges and to understand across tribes and to help translate some of this. David, you worked for President Obama, who in 2008 ran for president, telling Rick Warren, an evangelical minister, that he believed marriage was between one man and one woman. 8 years later, he leaves office, and same-sex marriage is the law of the land. You could excuse a lot of people who are traditional in their cultural and theological values to have their heads spinning during that time, saying, well, what is happening to this country? This is not a place I recognize anymore. So there is a seed of authentic bewilderment and grievance and fear that has sort of blossomed into an unhealthy militant nationalism that has infected much of the American evangelical movement. And that militant nationalist populist brew makes them in many ways sort of a perfect ally, a perfect mark, if you will, for someone like Donald Trump.
That was worth the time. Yeah. Read the book. It's really, really informative, including the note that you got after you spoke at your father's funeral. Just recount that for 1 second. I'm giving you more time now. But talk about the note that one of his parishioners
Yeah, so sure. I just, my dad died 5 years ago this summer, and we had a very, very good relationship. And he was the pastor of what had grown to be a pretty large church in suburban Detroit. And he died just within days of my having published a book about Trump's takeover of the party. And I had interviewed Trump for that book. I had interviewed everybody in the Republican Party for that book to really try to make sense of what had happened in the years since George W. Bush left office. And because I was very critical of Trump in the book, I was then sort of in the crosshairs of right-wing media and Rush Limbaugh, among others. So when my dad died, and I went home to my church where I'd grown up since I was this big, a number of people sort of confronted me and were very angry, wanting to know if I was still a Christian, if I was still on the right side of good versus evil. How could it be that I was criticizing someone like Donald Trump? And that ultimately culminated in the next day. I was so bothered by, this was at the Visitation with my dad in a box 50 feet away while people are litigating these disputes with me. So the next day when I gave the eulogy, I was a little irritated and decided to sort of let it rip a little bit and talk about, are you being discipled by the Gospels, or are you being discipled by AM talk radio? Because it can't be both, right? Not everyone took that very well. And one gentleman who I'd known since I was 5 years old, who's been an elder in the church, was one of my dad's closest friends, he gave me a note after the service, after we buried my dad, that basically accused me of being a traitor, said that I was a part of the deep state, that I was doing the devil's work by undermining God's ordained leader of this country, Donald J. Trump. And I don't tell that for the shock value. I actually think that I think the shock value lies in the fact that that view set is not as extreme or not as fringe maybe as we want to believe that it is. That there is some, bless you, that there is some not insignificant portion of the white evangelical world that has been sort of co-opted by this sense of as I said, sort of militant nationalistic populism, and how that has then bled over from their spiritual identity into their political identity.
We should point out, just for the record, that we have two pastors' sons on the platform here, so we're well represented. Stephanie, you won in one of the swingiest of swing districts. The House, as we know, is now famously divided. What is you're still close to it, you watch all of this. What is your sense of what the House is going to look like after November?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to predict. I think the Senate might be the only one that I think I could put odds on, but the presidency and the House, to me, feels really unpredictable. And I think in large part it's because when you're running in a House seat, you can set yourself apart from the top of the ticket only so much. You can't overcome a double-digit top of the ticket negative. So if Biden in your district is down double digits, you're probably going to get swept out too. And so I think and we just went through the reapportionment, and we haven't had enough time or people moving around for those lines to soften a little. I mean, when we have reapportionment, everybody draws their lines as blue as possible and as red as possible. And we're not far enough from the census for there to be some wiggle room. And since the House is just so closely, it's like 5 seats, 2 seats, depending on deaths and sickness and stuff. I imagine that whatever happens this fall, whoever is in control will also have a very narrow majority, which makes, it's been messy, this Congress, with that narrow majority, and a little chaotic. But the good news, I think, if we want to see the silver lining, is that they have more or less governed from the middle out. That has been the only path to getting bills passed, because the Republicans can't hold all of their votes. And so bills that have passed have been bills that have been passed with both significant Democratic and Republican votes. And, that's bipartisanship. It's just a really ugly way to get there.
Yeah. Could be different if the constellation is a Republican president and a Republican Senate. And Claire, you keep an eye on your old stomping grounds there. Democrats are deeply exposed in this election. Almost, I would say every competitive seat is held by a Democrat, and 3 of them are in states that Donald Trump carried by some significant margin: West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio. Do you see a path for Democrats to hang on to the Senate?
I do. Not in West Virginia. The bulldog will come to Washington. That's the governor of West Virginia's bulldog. I mean, if you haven't seen it, it's ridiculous. But I love dogs. Don't get me wrong. I'm not the governor of North Dakota.
Gravel pit
Did you
moment.
see, by the way, just let me direct, the poll that said 66% of people disapproved of Kristi Noem killing her dogs? 66%. And it turns out the other 34% were cats.
There you go. Ba-boom, ba-boom. I think, you have a really interesting situation where Biden is lucky that we have competitive Senate races in states he must win. And those Senate races are way better funded than the Republican side. I'm nervous talking about this in front of Amy because this is what she eats for breakfast. But if you look at Arizona, flawed candidate on the Republican side, Ruben Gallego is holding his own and ahead. That helps in there. We got Jackie Rosen in Nevada. She is, even though they picked a candidate they think could really take her out, she's holding her own there. Obviously, Tammy Baldwin has some comfort in Wisconsin. A really strong candidate in Michigan, which I think will ultimately be fine for Biden and for the Senate. Now, John and Sherrod.
John Tester.
John Tester and
Montana,
Sherrod
Ohio.
Brown in Ohio. They have the toughest. But they each have a unique situation in that they are known as who they are. They're they're very authentic. I mean, John Tester, when Donald Trump called him fat and he said, well, big sky is for big guys. He's proud of his fingers being ground down to nothing in the meat grinder when he was butchering his own cows off his own farm. He's on the combine every weekend. Montana knows that. He is a real deal in Montana. I would bet he holds on. Sherrod is the toughest one, I think. By the way, I think Bob Casey is going to hold on in Pennsylvania. Also will help Biden because he's the nicest guy on the planet. And McCormick has issues. We got some carpetbagger issues with this really rich businessman who, frankly, has homes everywhere but Pennsylvania by all descriptions. And so, I think it's possible they hold on. Now, they don't hold on if Biden doesn't win the presidency because I think it'll be 50-50. So, ironically, whether or not Chuck Schumer remains majority leader will probably depend more on whether Joe Biden wins than any other race in the country, because I do think that we have a chance of 50-50.
Can we, let me just interrupt and say we're going to take questions in 1 minute. So if anybody has questions, please line up behind that microphone. We're going to prioritize students for the first several questions. And I mean current students, not former students. Amy, just do you have you want any rebuttal time?
Yeah, well, no. I think to me, one of the most fascinating things about the Senate is not just who's in control. Let's just assume that Trump wins. If Trump wins, then the Senate flips no matter what. It's 50-50 Senate. But how many seats Republicans have matters a lot, too, because you've got these two people named Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and then probably Cassidy as well, who, the senator from Louisiana, 3 Republicans who have not been shy about being in Trump's way, not giving him everything that he wants. And so they sort of become the cinema and mansion of the Senate, but in this case, of course, on the Republican side. So when we talk about what could happen if it's a full red takeover, you also have to remember that in the Senate for these confirmations, for what gets through a United States Senate, if it's just a 51 or 52 seat Republican majority, you do have people who could.
I think the big question is, if Trump's president, does he try and do away with a filibuster? And is it more vulnerable without Mitch
would think the
McConnell
same
as the
thing.
majority
I would
leader?
think the
So
same thing.
we shall see. Let's take some questions here.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Marco Soproniuk. I'm a graduating MBA student at the business school and a student advisory board member at the IOP. I'm asking this question as a proud Chicagoan. In April last year, I was very excited when the city was chosen for the Democratic Convention. I've been really looking forward to it, but at some point last summer and onwards, it became clear that dark clouds were gathering over the convention between the migrant crisis and now with protesters. My question is, how would you recommend the Democratic Party and the city of Chicago to handle and respond to potential protests at the convention and make sure that we avoid the disaster of 1968? Thank you.
Astead, you're a Chicagoan.
Suburbs, to be clear. But but let me tell you something that won't make you feel better. For the Times, we just had our security meeting about the DNC, and nothing made me feel worse. Like, I think dark clouds are forming, and I don't know what you do about them, to be honest. And the idea of CPD having a perimeter where people are going to have a First Amendment badge to be in public sounds like the worst option. So, yeah, I think about it in a similar way. I mean, as we've seen some reporting of, the Democrats are going to try to move some of it to virtual or that, but I mean, that doesn't feel like a solution. It feels like an avoidance. I think that, I don't know. I would say that I've talked to some of those folks who are planning to come and protest. I don't know whether there is a message or something that can happen there, but I do think the moment can be, as we've talked about here at the IOP, can be a larger galvanizing thing around kind of political engagement. So that isn't the only story being told here, but I do think that it's principally a party problem, and it's a party problem that's not falling on Chicago in the way that I find kind of personally disappointing, but I don't know how you avoid it.
And it's a challenging problem for the Biden campaign, because anything that bespeaks chaos goes on his account, and that gives an impetus to any group or malign state actor who wants to throw a log on the fire to do so. And I think we'll see some of that.
And the question is, will there be the same kind of disruptions in Milwaukee? We aren't talking enough about Milwaukee. For the life of me, I don't understand why protesters wouldn't mass in Milwaukee. I mean, that is a much bigger problem in terms of the nuance of this very difficult issue than what's going on at the Democratic convention. So they're trying to move back. The Republicans are busy trying to get the Secret Service to insist to move back from the venue where the protests will occur. So keep your eyes on Milwaukee, because these kids, the legitimate protesters, not the ones who are trying to hurt a candidate, but are the legitimate protesters, I have a feeling they'll show up in Milwaukee. And we need to talk more about that, not just act like, oh, the sky's going to fall in Chicago. The sky may fall in Milwaukee, too.
Yeah. What would be more useful would be if a whole bunch of abortion rights supporters were to protest there, I imagine. But anyway, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jacob Steinberg. I'm a second year in the college, and I think it's pretty fair to say that the Republican message is very salient. People are tuned into what they're saying. But when you look at Trump rallies and when Trump is delivering that message, it looks different than what the party is saying. It's more divisive, it's more intense, and it's probably going to hit home a little less. And I forget who mentioned it, but there was an idea that the Democrats' issue might not be a message issue, but a messenger issue. And so my question is, do the Republicans have a potential problem in the fact that their message might work, but the main person who's going to deliver their message doesn't deliver it as probably most of the party would hope?
I would just say that Donald Trump has, since leaving office, said that we should terminate the Constitution. He has faced 90 plus criminal counts. He's been in and out of court. He's had a mugshot taken. And all of the data that I have been looking at, that my peers have been looking at, shows us that it hasn't hurt him. So I think the American public is pretty well desensitized to Donald Trump. And that's not to say that at the margins, particularly with suburban women, as Senator McCaskill said, that could hurt. It could. But I think we also have to recognize that this is not the electorate. So often in politics, we're fighting the last battle. I mean, after Obama won in 08 and then again in 12, we're talking about the coalition of the ascendant and how this changes politics. We are in a completely different universe now. I mean, I've had Republicans close to Trump say to me more than once, and pardon the offense here, this is just me quoting them verbatim, saying, for every Karen we lose, we're going to pick up a Jamal and an Enrique, right? And they might be right about that. So for the people who might be turned off by some of Trump's rhetoric and his divisiveness and his antagonism, he is also potentially appealing to just as many people, non-traditional Republican voters, who might be brought into the tent by that very thing. So I just think that there's been a lot of self-soothing among Democrats in recent years, hoping that he will continue to be his own worst enemy and lose this for himself somehow. But I just think that huge portions of the electorate have become numb to it.
And how haughty was it to assume that a rising majority of people of color would all move in one direction? That was a really flawed assumption.
Preach.
That was a really racist assumption, in my opinion. And so I think that the belief of the ascendant is one that we're still seeing those chickens come home to roost, because just because there was going to be more black people or Latinos or Asians did not mean that those people are inherently going to be Democrats. And so a party took for granted a group of people, and they are still paying those consequences.
Well, if the Republican Party embraces what you just said, maybe they'll feel better about immigration. Hey, are you online? I'm pointing in the orange. Can you jump up to the front of the microphone? I think it would be good if we had some women asking questions as well as.
Thank you. My name is Victoria. I'm a first-year Ukrainian Master of Public Policy student here at Harris, and I've got a really tough question. So, contingent on the election results, in your personal opinion, how is it going to impact the U.S. aid to Ukraine? In what direction and in what scale?
Tim, you want to? Claire, go ahead.
I think that if Donald Trump is elected, he will undermine NATO. I think he will continue to be besties with the bad guys around the world. That is all bad news for Ukraine. And even worse is what I see in the Republican Party. I mean, Mitch McConnell really put everything on the line to try to get the Ukrainian aid through within his own party. He is not going to be the leader anymore. And depending on how these Senate elections turn out, right now, about 55 to 60% of the Republican caucus in the Senate is still of the belief that we need to be supporting NATO and countering Putin and what he's done to the Ukrainian people. But those numbers are shifting towards the crazy town that is the policy that, well, it doesn't matter what happens in Ukraine. And I think it's crazy. I mean, some of you may disagree, but I think it's really important we continue to support Ukraine. Biden gets reelected, I think it'll be fine. If Trump gets reelected, there's a reason why Europe is so worried, and a reason why particularly the people of Ukraine are so worried.
Okay, Stephanie, you've got a deep background in national security.
As well, so. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with what Claire said. I think you may also see, if it is a Trump presidency, a more transactional approach to American foreign policy, one that is focused heavily on the trade debt or deficit that a country has with the United States. It's his number one question when he's being briefed to meet with a world leader. He wants to know what that debt or surplus is, and so deficit or surplus is. And so you may see a much more transactional approach to our foreign policy. And if the ally or the recipient country doesn't provide some sort of tangible value and allow America to win, they may be traded out for whatever he's interested in.
Thank you. The patient gentleman behind her.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Landrin. I'm a first year in the college majoring in political science. And I guess as a young voter, I'm very interested in the youth vote. I think having lived on a college campus for the past few months, it's been blatantly obvious to me, on the one hand, how much the conflict in the Middle East has hurt Biden and the Democratic Party. I've heard the moniker Genocide Joe more times than I can count in the past month. But also I've seen just in general vast disillusionment with both candidates. And so, I don't know, especially amongst my friends and my peers, low turnout seems like a very real possibility from us young people. And so I'm curious as to how, especially in swing states, you guys will think the youth vote will impact this election.
Amy,
You go talk about just what they do. Well, you talk about Wisconsin, because you were just there, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, so I was just in Arizona, Wisconsin, focusing specifically on this kind of question, and you're picking up on the right things. We have seen a big drop off to the point I just said about like Biden only being up by 9% among 18 to 34. Like that, from a Democratic perspective, it's a pretty disastrous number. And so you also, to your point, when we dig into that, it's a lot less of his pitch to young people originally, even as they really didn't love him in the last time, was kind of the emergency situation of Trump's presidency and also a marginal policy better than the other. I think the Middle East has really changed that. When we talk to a lot of Gen Z folks, they're like, I don't see a marginal, better option. I see them as reflective of a two-party problem. I think that there could be a version of this election that Democrats could speak to kind of system distaste more directly, but that's not where you're getting from them right now. Like, what they're telling you things are fine. They're not saying they're not fine and they would do something about it. And so if they don't speak to that among young people, I do expect that drop off to be real. I don't think it's always, I think issues though, abortion, economy, like democracy protection, sometimes still really speak to that crowd. And so if they can find a way to remove it from the individual candidate and say the reason to vote is not Joe Biden, but is in the protection of rights.
But Astead, let me just cut you off because in the interest of time, I just want to ask you a follow-up on that, which is, isn't it possible that young people will vote but not vote in the presidential or
Absolutely.
vote third party?
But in Arizona, we just met a whole bunch of people who are saying, I will vote for this abortion referendum, I will vote for Ruben Gallego in the Senate, but I'm not voting for Joe Biden.
Next, please.
Republicans denounce the Democrats for politically motivated lawfare, but the truth of the matter is Merrick Garland was too pusillanimous to indict Trump under the insurrection statute, 18 United States Code, Section 2383, where the penalty is disqualification from holding office. And Republicans' legal theories generally say that prosecution is a quintessentially presidential decision. They denounce the special counsel regulations on that ground. So one tack Biden could take in the debate is just come out with hellfire and brimstone and charge Trump verbally with insurrection and treason against the Constitution. But that should be backed up by adding that insurrection charge and really come out full bore. So this would be based on the theory that it's really Trump's show of strength, that he's really campaigning against the legal system. So Biden should come out campaigning with hellfire and brimstone for the legal system.
I meant to mention, thank you. I meant to mention about this question thing that it should have a question mark at the end of it. But we take your point, and honestly, I think it's fair to say that he would benefit from coming out with fire and brimstone on any subject in this debate. But go ahead. You're next. Yes.
Hi, I'm Carmelita Rivera, lifelong Hyde Parker, proud Democrat. I agree with Tim's opinion on how strong the instinct is to feel hate and to feel fear. And to me, it's almost as strong as being hungry. You just have to delve into that, and that's really scary to me on the part of Republicans. The second thing I wanted to say was to Claire, throughout this election cycle, there have been some elections, like isn't Virginia, doesn't it have like a Democratic legislation now? And Michigan and Wisconsin. And I know that like yesterday, Louisiana voted strongly for voting rights, something like that.
Well, the Supreme Court issued a decision that there'll be another majority black district on the ballot. So that's one in the D's column that we didn't know that we would have.
Well, see, to me, some of these, the polls are one thing, but actual elections, even small elections, are indicators, and it gives me hope for Democrats, and like Katie Hobbs winning Arizona, this kind of thing. And the last question is for David. Do you agree with Mitt Romney that President Biden should have pardoned Trump?
I was surprised by that. I mean, I think there could come a time and place for that, but I think there are a lot of Americans who think that the issue should be tried and he should be held accountable, and then it would be up to the president to decide whether whether he would serve a penalty for it. But it's also sort of an academic question because it didn't happen, and I'm not quite sure why he raised it when he raised it.
Can I take the point about the elections where Democrats, right? That and it's such an important point because the election results have not lined up with what the polling says. Correct? If Trump is, or if Biden's so unpopular, why did Democrats do so well in the midterms? If Biden stinks so badly, why do they keep winning these special elections? One of the answers, and one of the groups that we're going to be watching, we talk a lot about these groups that my colleagues here have mentioned, this idea about who's a consistent voter and who's an inconsistent voter. And this is a fascinating divide that we're seeing now, which is for years, we have assumed that the people who turn out regularly, because we know who regular turnout voters are, right? They're older, they have a higher level of education, they have a higher income, they're usually whiter, right? And those people were usually Republicans. And they now are reliably Democratic. So the most reliable voters, the people who show up for the school board elections and the off-year elections and the special elections are voting Democrat. The people who don't turn out in every election, the folks that Astead's talking to, they're younger. And by the very fact that they're younger, if you're Gen Z, you are more likely to be a person of color. They aren't turning out in every election. And what they see of the system and what they're concerned about is not what the super voters are concerned about. And this is why the question is,
in a large
why is that
presidential turnout, what happens?
Right, when a big turnout happens. We saw this in 2020 and in 2022. The people, especially in places like Nevada and Arizona, who showed up in 2022, Latino voters who showed up in 2022, they were more of the consistent voters. When you polled the people who didn't show up in 2022, they kind of like Trump.
Yeah.
So this is why you have to take both of those things. I think it's very important, your point, that special elections, Democrats have been successful. So the turnout matters.
So wait, I've got to cut you off because we're out of time, and we stole all these people from our IOP board meeting, and we have to actually resume the board meeting. And for that reason also, I don't want you to think we're impolite, but we're not going to stop and chat with you because we'll get upbraided on the way out. But thank you so much. And thank you to Stephanie Murphy, Tim Alberta, Claire McCaskill, Astead Herndon, and Amy Walter. Splendid panel. Thank you so much.